Well, I'm certainly glad your check-in went well, Pat Armstrong. That wig looks great, by the way. Gemma is really good at this stuff. I'm making my rounds throughout the building and keeping an eye on security rotations. Get that jump drive in and get to work. I want out of here as quickly as possible.
The Reconstruction era lasts from about 1865 to 1877. Essentially, the South was devastated, and a little slight ironic twist, the federal government said that it's the state's responsibility to rebuild the states, not the federal government's. What the federal government's role was to reestablish the Union, protect freedmen, and if you remember the Union's two goals during the Civil War, preserving the Union and freeing the slaves, they fit right in with that. During Reconstruction, we remember that we're not just reconstructing the South, we're actually rebuilding the Constitution, because slavery was built into the Constitution. So they had to rebuild what it meant to be a U.S. Republican democracy. The former Confederates didn't want to lose out on white domination in the South, and the federal government wanted to protect the freedmen's rights. So there was this tension throughout the Reconstruction period. Now, initially, Lincoln and then his successor, Johnson, wanted to reconstruct the Union fairly quickly. We call this presidential reconstruction. Only 10% of the population had to swear allegiance. They had to agree to the 13th Amendment. But Lincoln is killed before this plan goes into effect, and Johnson takes over. But Johnson wasn't really suited to the role. He was a Southerner. He was essentially a Democrat, not a Republican. But he was on the ballot as vice president just to get Southerners to vote. So what essentially happens is the Confederacy strikes back. They wanted to keep their way of life, and their way of life was based on the subservience of the slave population. So they wanted a subservient labor force, and they wanted to have some control over national politics, essentially the states' rights argument. So once the former Confederate states reestablished themselves, were re-allowed back into the Union, they immediately became defiant. They passed black codes, which were essentially laws trying to re-enslave the black population. They elected former Confederate officials to both national and state offices. Here's an example of the black codes. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted to rent a house or keep a house in town under any circumstance. This is just trying to re-enslave the black population. And this is where early white supremacist groups begin to emerge. They were trying to use violence to protect their way of life from outside influence. In other words, they were vigilantes. They were trying to enforce unwritten laws. This is not democracy. They limited the freedmen and Republican rights. This was mob rule. This is tyranny of the greatest kind. The federal government tried to assist by creating the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a federal agency. They provided services to both freedmen and displaced white populations. They provided legal services like helping to make sharecropper agreements. They established schools, churches, and families, tried to help find families. And the Freedmen's Bureau became the target of KKK and other white supremacy organizations. Because the Southerners acted in such a defiant way, that's what led to what's called radical Reconstruction. This is where the radical Republicans, those Northerners in Congress, took action to try to protect the results of the Civil War. They immediately barred the Southern officials from coming to Congress because the Southerners would block any legislation that would get passed. And then after the 1866 election, Congress was able to override presidential vetoes. They even impeached Johnson and threatened to remove him in office. He was impeached. And largely Johnson stopped trying to prevent Congress from doing anything. So Congress passed something called the Military Reconstruction Act, trying to use the troops to protect the freedmen in the South. There's never enough troops to do anything about this. But this is part of that lost cause mythology that the Northerners were just being mean and forcing the Southerners to act against their will.
Hey, Dan. How's it going? Everything's looking pretty good here in the lobby. Normal stuff. A couple of people having drinks at the bar. A little early for me, but who am I to judge? One even kind of looks like my sister. It's weird, huh? Now that I think about it, it's been long enough that I'm forgetting some details. Anyways, a little security's starting to filter in, which is expected. Dukes isn't supposed to be here personally for a while, here and tomorrow. But his advanced staff is here. One of them must have the archive device. That's why you're able to pick up that signal. Anyways, keep going. I'll check in later.
There are three major amendments that come out of this period. The first is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. In order for the Confederate states to rejoin the Union, they had to agree to the 13th Amendment. The former Confederates attempted to get around this by finding loopholes such as the black codes. The reason that the 13th Amendment was passed was because Lincoln wanted to uphold the gains of the Emancipation Proclamation, because it would change the Constitution. Therefore, the Supreme Court would be unable to revoke emancipation. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment that we have, and the most important amendment that comes out of this time period. First of all, it overturned the Dred Scott case. Remember that the Dred Scott case argued that slaves were never intended to be part of the citizenry. So this gave former slaves citizenship rights. It also created the concept of birthright citizenship, the idea that if you are born in this country, you are part of this country, you are a citizen. This isn't the case for every country. It also provides due process and equal protection for all citizens, not just white citizens. It gave Congress the power to protect all of these rights. It's a very different interpretation of the Constitution than would have been previously there. In the First Amendment, it says that Congress shall make no law, which means Congress does not have the power to do something. It limits the power of the central government. That was the point of the Bill of Rights. The 14th Amendment is a different interpretation. It says that Congress has the power to protect these rights, which means Congress can now impose its will on the states. So the 14th Amendment is often brought into cases, even today, dealing with different rights, because it changes the power of the central government. We live in a second version of the Constitution. We don't really have the founders' vision anymore. The Constitution changes over time. This is the version that we're living under now. It increases the federal power by giving the government power to control the states.
Hey, just checking in. Everything looks good in the stairwells. Security looks to be setting up a 60-minute rotation on the radios or so. Without Dukes here, it looks like they're getting a little sloppy. Usually it's every half hour at least. They check in with a password, but I haven't gotten close enough to hear what it is yet. Anyways, keep up the work so we can get out of here soon. Alright.
The other amendment was the 15th Amendment, which ensured voting rights of all male citizens, both North and South, not denied on the basis of race, creed, previous condition of servitude. Notice they forgot to add women in there. The 15th Amendment was tied into the 14th Amendment because voting is a right of citizenship. The Republicans were also a bit cynical here because they knew that the freedmen would vote for Republicans, the party of Lincoln, the emancipator, so they're bringing in this very large voting population into their base. And it's the 14th, 15th Amendment that the KKK initially was formed, and other vigilante groups were formed to try to get rid of. The KKK initially didn't just kill black men, they killed Republicans and black men. So it was an effort to try to stop people from voting Republican. We're looking at the positive reactions from African Americans. First of all, the African Americans, we're going to call them freedmen now, they gained social freedoms, freedom of movement, which they hadn't had before. And many went initially and searched for their families, which during slavery era, they had been broken up and sold apart. Many of which had been sold down the river, which was a punishment, literally sold down the river into the deep south. Most ended up on the plantations, though, where they'd been slaves. They had freedom of movement, but most of them didn't move very far. They moved away from the big house and out further in. Please be aware that there are misconceptions here. Most freedmen stayed in the South, and most freedmen stayed right on the plantation where they had been enslaved. Some moved out to the West, and they're called exodusters, but not many. The Great Migration, which is the movement north, doesn't occur for about another 40 or 50 years until World War I. The freedmen did gain social rights, which means they no longer had to worry about the master's control or inspections or the prying eyes. So they formed churches, and they could preach about whatever they wanted. They formed schools, usually with the Freedmen's Bureau's help. Education was incredibly important. This does not mean the slaves were uneducated. It means that they were very good at what they did. They knew the land. They wanted to have a piece of land they could farm. And even at the moment of emancipation, about 10% of slaves were educated. And it's those people, those freedmen, that were going to go on and become the leadership within the society. Another one of those lost cause myths is that African Americans were unintelligent, but that is just not true. The Freedmen's Bureau was created, the federal agency, helped transition to liberation, help build schools, churches, find families, assist with contracts. It's controversial. It doesn't live past 1872, mostly because of the violence of white supremacists. Many focused on higher education. Black colleges were formed at this time period, mostly from northern philanthropists, which means people that give to charity, also religious organizations, and people like Booker T. Washington. They had political gains, the freedmen did. The 15th Amendment allowed freedmen to vote. We call that suffrage. Some freedmen and many white radical Republicans are going to be elected in the South, both to Congress and to their state legislatures. This is the first group of African Americans elected to the House of Representatives. Now, Reconstruction in the era of Southern governments, though, Republicans are going to be elected, both by freedmen. Some people are going to call Northerners that come into the South carpetbaggers. People in the South that try to improve the South are going to be called scalawags, traitors to the Southern way of life. Lost cause mythology overstates how dominant the Northerners and traitors were, because it has to. If the Southerners want to feel good about themselves, they have to say that they were being occupied by Northern aggressors. So this is the idea that it dominates. And it inaccurately portrays the government as corrupt and inept. If you look at the Harper's Weekly picture here, these are obvious stereotypes that are being used against African Americans at the end of Reconstruction, trying to show them as ignorant, vile, savage, bad people. And you can see the white man here sort of like rubbing his nose, just frustrated by all this. This is not how the governments were. It's the image that's portrayed after Reconstruction ends to talk about how great it is now that white supremacy is back in charge.
Banana. Can you believe that? I just heard the password. It's banana. You think that's an appealing password? Maybe that'll help us out later if we need it. I hope not. Banana.
There's little economic success during this time period because freedmen lacked land. Sometimes it's referred to as 40 acres and a mule. This land redistribution never occurred because it was overturned later. The legal system said that the land was private property. It could not be confiscated and redistributed and given to slaves. It had to stay in the hands of the former slave masters. And without owning land and having had no salaries before this, they had little ability to improve their situation. They're not ignorant, lazy, or wasteful, even though this is claims that are to be made later on to justify white supremacy. It's not that. It's just they had lacked the resources. The system that they fell into is called sharecropping, or sometimes called crop lien. They're borrowing against future crops. Because many of the African American freedmen had to stay on the land that they were living, and that land was reverting back to the former slave masters. They had to somehow make a living. The essential system works this way. The sharecropper would receive land and seed, but they had no money to buy it. So they borrowed it and promised a percentage of their crop next year to the former plantation owner. Their former master would then buy the food and clothes on credit, which they would then have to give a higher percentage of the crop. The sharecropper would plant and harvest, and then they would, step number 4, they would give the landowner the crop to sell, and the sharecropper would get half the earnings minus their debt from the year. And sometimes that meant that they owed more than they had earned because the crop prices went down or they didn't grow as much as they thought they would, which means in order to pay the debt, they would promise a greater share of next year's crop. What ends up happening is these sharecroppers get into debt 5, 6, 7 years worth of crops, and they can never get out. Now, what's really interesting is this becomes a de facto subservient workforce. Freedmen are tied to the plantation. They might move away from the big house, but they are still tied to the land and the master, their former master. And now the former master doesn't even have to feed and clothe them. This is the free market system. They're on their own. So sharecropping also includes not only the African American freedmen, but also the poor white farmers in the area as well. About the ending of Reconstruction. So we should probably figure out what some of the forces are that lead to the end. Democracy had been expanded in the South and actually everywhere. But unfortunately, over time, the federal support of the freedmen eroded. There are a number of reasons for this. A lot of it had to do with the Southern efforts to return to that antebellum way of life. There's a number of anti-freedmen or anti-Republican factions emerging. The whole goal of the things like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts, were to intimidate Republican voters, including blacks and whites, often with the threat of violence. In fact, the KKK is sometimes seen as a militant wing of the Southern Democratic Party at this time. Yes, the federal troops had been used to try to protect freedmen's rights. They had been sent into the South due to the Military Reconstruction Act. The Freedmen's Bureau was in the South until about 1872, but there was never enough to protect everyone there. And as the 1870s went on, the economic and physical intimidation of African Americans and Republicans in the South, it only increased throughout the 1870s. Lynchings were common as a way to intimidate both the Republicans and African Americans. It had a drastic effect. This is 1868, right in the middle of the positive benefits of Reconstruction. You can see the red territories are Republican, which is the pro-freedmen. And then by 1872, you can see that while this is just before the violence really starts, the Republicans are making more inroads, but the Democrats in the South are starting to gain some territory. And then by 1876, only 4 years later, the Democrats in the South largely have taken over again. This is largely due to voter intimidation. And then by 1880, we see a very solid South. Sometimes it's referred to as the redeemed South, which implies that the wrong people were in charge and that they had to be put back in their place, that the Republicans and the African Americans and the carpetbags and the scalawags and all that had to be kicked out. This was done through intimidation, returning former veteran Confederates into places of power. The North's war weariness was, Northern families were hoping to get their sons out of the South soon. All this adds up to Republicans and African Americans losing their voice in the election. The South became firmly Democratic, which means white supremacist, until the 1970s. What we have now is a 100-year period known as Jim Crow. Remember that the redemption myth is a key to the lost cause trait, and it can be seen throughout South Carolina history. We have Confederate soldier memorials, Confederate women's memorials, the Jefferson Davis Highway, bronze stars marking where the Southern State House was attacked, Robert E. Lee, two Robert E. Lees. All of this is Wade Hampton, the first white governor after the redemptions. Benjamin Tillman, which is sometimes called Pitchfork Ben, overthrew a legitimate black government in the Hamburg Massacre. All of these are issues that suggest, by the way, this is the only African American monument we have outside of the State House. All of these are issues that suggest that the redemption myth really has taken hold here in South Carolina.
Ah, dang it. I was chatting up the lobby clerk when I heard one of the security guards check in with that password, tomato. Tomato! It's not even a fruit. Or maybe it is. I don't know. The problem is, I don't know what the system is. Is it a fruit? Is it vegetables? Both? Just nonsense words? I guess it's better to know, but still, I better go. Someone's taking a look at me.
Reconstruction officially ended in 1877 with what's referred to as the corrupt bargain. The federal government its support of the freedmen had been dwindling since the early 1870s, partially because of the increased violence of groups like the KKK, partially because the lynchings had become so prevalent and they didn't want to prosecute them, all those other things. So essentially the freedmen were no longer protected in the South. And there was corruption within the Grant administration. The president at the time, nobody could link any of the corruption to Grant directly. There was a depression that hit in 1873, so we see this every time this happens in an economic depression. Oftentimes social justice issues, in this case freedmen being treated like actual citizens, gets overshadowed. There's war weariness, increased violence against freedmen. All of this made the North feel like nothing's going to change. So they just gave up and they decided to leave. So that in the election of 1876, white Southern Democrat influence increased over the national elections. There was a tie in the presidential electoral college. When there's a tie or no clear majority is decided, the election is then thrown into the House of Representatives, which decides the election. The Republican, the Northerner in this case, Rutherford Hayes, promised that the House Republican Committee designed to decide who's going to be the next president, that if he were made president, he would end Reconstruction in the South. He would pull out the troops and he'd be able, the Southerners would be able to go on their merry way. This is often called the corrupt bargain of 1877. Sometimes it's called the compromise of 1877. And Southern Democrats agreed to make Republican Rutherford Hayes president because they were playing a long game. They knew that if Hayes was made president and pulled the military out and stopped Reconstruction efforts, there would be no oversight. And African Americans would be left to fend for themselves. Republicans would be forced to flee in the face of the KKK and others. So African Americans left to fend for themselves against an increasingly hostile and unregulated environment. And we're going to see this all the way up to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. About 100 years of Jim Crow South, where they may be citizens in name, but they're second class in practice. After Reconstruction ends, the South becomes what's referred to as the Jim Crow South. Segregation is the rule. By law, there's segregation. We call that de jure segregation. African Americans essentially were made second class citizens. This socially is important. The social elites feared a united poor underclass. Sharecropping was not unique to African Americans. Both the blacks and the whites were subject to sharecropping agreements. Race became a wedge issue to keep the poor whites and the poor black farmers from uniting against their upper class masters at this point. Segregation laws encouraged poor whites to feel superior, things like separate facilities, black and white water fountains and such. Essentially, this is divide and conquer for the white upper class. It's also based on previous racial bias. This is not something new that was introduced after Reconstruction ended, but it's enhanced during this period. This is upheld by the Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson decided that to have separate facilities was okay. This negates that whole equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. We're going to see that this is what gets changed in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. Essentially, it says that the states are free to discriminate.
All right, hey, I was right. Someone was watching me in the lobby, so I'm headed to my room. Remember the knock we set up? If I need to get you in a hurry, I'll come to your room. You stay there and I'll come to you. I hope my tale is just some jack and not an official. God, I hope it's not an enforcer. Jacks aren't that bright. Officials, enforcers, on the other hand. Anyways, I'll be in touch.
By 1896, which is when Plessy versus Ferguson occurred, the federal government essentially legitimized racial discrimination. Why? For the sake of unity. In order to keep those southern states happy and to keep the country together. And to make up for all the problems that were caused by the Civil War. This is part of that reunionist mentality. Again, ignore the social justice issues. Ignore all men are created equal. Focus on things like the economy and the fact that we're all working together. There are several voting rights restrictions. You know these. But remember that Jim Crow laws are not just voting restriction acts. It's also the segregation acts. The former Confederate states passed things like the poll tax, literacy test, the grandfather clause. So without having the right to vote, essentially freedmen had no protection. And because the freedmen had no protection against the state governments, the sharecropping and hiring discrimination increased, which increased their poverty levels. It's a vicious cycle. When cotton prices fell, the sharecroppers fell further into debt. Some left for northern cities looking for better jobs, but most of them stayed where they were, not knowing how to escape the situation. It's not for another 40 or 50 years that the Great Migration happens. So most people stayed right where they were. So the disenfranchisement of African Americans was important to white supremacy, that the black population was much higher in the South than in the North. So to take away the vote was very important to ensure white supremacy. Now, to be fair, the progressives are going to do the same thing in northern cities. And it's arguable that this decision by the redeemers in the South still haunts modern post-Reconstruction America. It led to the Civil Rights era, the 70s racist Southern strategies, some of the 1980s campaigns. Even modern voting patterns were influenced by this decision to create this underclass of citizens.
Hey, what can I do for you? All right. Look, 10. The best we got is like 50 minutes. I'm heading into your hall to keep an eye out. I hope this guy checked in recently, but I don't know, so you better work fast.
Coming up next on the History Underground.
We don't have a lot of time. Booby trapped. Nothing to maim or kill, but it's not going to feel good.
Hello.
As you pass by the other cells, you see their heads hung low. You are the next executioner.